Okay, hi, let's finish up chapter 1 with our third and final section on research methods. So in this, we're going to be talking about the research methods that are used to study human development and family studies. So in this lecture, we'll talk through the scientific method, common measurements used in the field, different research designs, and ethics. All right, I bet you've learned about the scientific method somewhere along the way, and this also applies to the field of human development and family studies. Researchers identify a research question they're interested in, like does reading to toddlers improve their literacy in elementary school? Or how far can babies see? Or are affairs more common for men than for women? And then they propose a hypothesis, like what they think they're going to find. And this kind of helps guide their research methods in their design, which then they choose. Are they doing, we're going to get into examples, are they doing interviews? Are they doing surveys? Are they doing this cross-sectionally, which is the design at one point in time, or are they doing it longitudinally over time? Then they have to recruit their participants, collect their data, and then analyze it and talk about the results and the implications. And this can lead to recommendations for how to prevent problems or how to intervene, or it can lead to changes in how we theorize about development. Okay, let's talk about qualitative and quantitative data. Both of these are considered empirical. I think a lot of times students think empirical studies are only those with statistics, but even data that's gathered through interviews, for example, is considered empirical. So qualitative is data we get that can help us describe something or understand something. We get pictures, we get words, we can come up with themes. And then quantitative data is statistics, and we can use those numbers to find correlations, to determine causality, depending upon our research design. And so researchers are going to be deciding what is the right form of data collection, and they might be doing some of both. They might be giving out surveys and doing more in-depth interviews. So for example, if I was trying to understand how work influences family, work-family spillover as it's called, I could be giving people surveys, right, about their hours at work, their stress at work, and then kind of, relationship satisfaction at home or divisions of labor at home. And that, if I was doing surveys on that, that would be a quantitative study, or that would be quantitative data. But I could also be conducting interviews with families about how their work experiences kind of spill over into their home life. Or I could be observing them. I could just be coming to work and watching them and making notes, and then coming to their homes and watching them and coming up with themes. And that would be more qualitative data. Okay, so a few more examples of the types of qualitative and quantitative methods that are often used in HDFS. So for qualitative interviews, like we talked about, ethnographic research, this is common, for example, in fields like sociology and anthropology, but happens in HDFS too. This is where you kind of live among the population that you're studying. So maybe you're studying sex workers in an urban environment, or you're studying unhoused youth. And so you're kind of hanging out with them and kind of observing or maybe doing interviews, but it's kind of all more in depth. And then there can be case studies too, where you just follow one kind of person or one family and go into more detail. And some of the more famous ones, right, have been children who were raised in isolation, right, or children who were assigned one sex at birth and how they do over time. Those would be kind of some more famous case studies. And then in terms of quantitative methods, right, we all fill out lots of surveys. They have a big advantage of you can get a lot of data fast. You can get a lot larger response. The challenge is you don't always know why people said what they said. It's hard to get at the why behind the answers. Observations is where we are looking at people's behavior rather than just what they're reporting, right, on a survey. Now, of course, if they know they're being observed, that can affect their behavior, but you generally have multiple people coding maybe a videotape of someone, a parent and a child interacting, and you're counting the number of positive interactions or the number of negative interactions, or how warm or how harsh, the parent is. And you can do that in a natural environment, like at a playground, or you could bring parents and kids into a lab and kind of videotape them and watch them through a one-way mirror, which we do quite a bit of in HDFS. For biological measurements, right, these are things like heart rate or blood pressure. Also, we're putting electrodes on people's heads and kind of measuring kind of brain activity. Would be all examples, and we do that in HDFS too. And then we have natural experiments or experiments, and these can be done using observations or scales too. It can all be combined. A natural experiment, we're going to talk more about this, but that's where we use a naturally occurring groups, right? We're not doing any random assignments. So it's twins, because you can't randomly assign people to be twins or not. It's people who have experienced violence or not. We can't randomly assign that. It's going to be naturally occurring. It's parents with a secure attachment and parents with an insecure attachment. And so we're bringing them in and we're watching them kind of, we're giving them a task, that they have to accomplish with their toddlers. And we're seeing, do the parents with a secure attachment kind of perform differently in problem solving this task with their toddlers than the parents and the toddlers with an insecure attachment. So those would all be examples of natural experiments using existing. And then, as experiments always involve kind of some sort of random assignment to two different groups. And again, you can be doing one research study that combines these methods. So when I was in graduate school, I worked on a study on work and family. We went into people's homes and we gave them surveys that they filled out that we could quantify. And then we also asked them kind of open-ended questions, like tell me about a turning point in your life, that we could then kind of analyze and code for themes. All right, you may have already got reliability and validity down, and if you do, great. The same way that we talk about it in other fields applies to HDFS too. So reliability is the consistency, and validity is the accuracy or the truthfulness. And so the example I often use for this is a bathroom scale, right? And so if I step on the scale to weigh myself in the morning, maybe like you, or I don't know if you do this too, but I often step on once, get a number, then I step back off and step on it again to see if I get the same number, right? So that's where I'm checking my scale's reliability. Am I getting a reliable number, the same number kind of back to back? And then if I wanted to know my scale's validity, right, because maybe my scale's just off by 2 pounds, then I need to compare my scale to another scale. So maybe I weigh myself at the gym in the morning, before I've had anything to eat or drink, and I compare that to what the number was at home. So how this can translate into, let's say a researcher is developing a measure of self-esteem, right? They're going to want to make sure that if you give somebody a self-esteem survey in the morning and then you give it to them again the next day or in the evening, we're still getting roughly the same number. Self-esteem shouldn't change too much in the short term. And then we also want to make sure, if we're creating a new measure, that we're actually measuring what people agree is self-esteem. So what we would do to figure that out is we would, if we had a new measure of self-esteem, we'd get scores on that and have subjects also answer the surveys for old measures of self-esteem, and we'd be making sure that they're correlating, that if you have high self-esteem on our new measure, you also have high self-esteem on our old measures. Okay, you've probably also heard about cross-sectional versus longitudinal, right? Cross-sectional is where we just gather data for one point in time. And longitudinal is where we take a group of people and we gather data from them over time, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. And so, for example, there's this finding that religiosity changes with age. On average, people get more religious in older years than in younger years. But then the question is this an age effect, or is this a cohort effect? And so a cohort effect we could determine through a cross-sectional study where we bring in 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 80-year-olds, and we survey them about religious beliefs, and we figure out if people who are born kind of later in the world, are less religious than people who were born, in generations past. But if we want to know if it's an age effect, if like all of us as we age on average become increasingly religious, then we have to follow the same people over time. And so then that would be, telling us that like, yes, on average, as you move through your lifespan, you become more religious. What researchers have found is that it's actually, the answer to this is it's both. It's both a cohort effect and an age effect. On average, people get more religious, and on average, older generations, people who were born in 1950, are more religious than people who were born in 2000, All right, I bet you've learned about correlation, and you've heard that mantra, correlation does not equal causation. Just because something's co-occurring doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. We'll talk more about that. So a correlation coefficient is a number between +1 and -1. And the closer it is to 1, either a +1 or a -1, the stronger the correlation. And again, it shows us that something is related, but it doesn't show us that something causes something else. Here's a reminder of what positive correlations look like and negative correlations. Positive doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad. Positive means as one goes up, the other goes up, and negative means as one, it's inverse, as one goes up, the other goes down. And so the examples here, as time spent studying goes up, grades in school go up. Again, it could be that people who are, kind of earning strong scores are also motivated to keep spending time studying. It's not necessarily that studying causes grades. Similarly, increased delinquency is correlated with decreased grades in school. Now, you could suggest that the more you're acting out, the less time that you're spending on your schoolwork, and it's going down. But it also can be that school isn't a place where you feel good. You're not kind of developing an identity or being stimulated there. And so you look to kind of more risky behaviors, for to stimulate yourself. Here's another way to view correlation, kind of a linear graph between two variables. And so again, this idea that exercise and physical health are correlated, we often talk about it as exercise causes positive physical health. And it does, of course, but we also know that your degree of physical health causes the exercise that you can do too. It's a bidirectional relationship. So if you're, in poor physical health, you might not be able to exercise as much as you'd like. So when we're trying to understand correlations, we have to understand that there's basically 3 reasons why something might be correlated. It can be that there's just a third variable that's causing both. And so kids viewing violent television has been correlated with kids' aggressive play. There was a period of time where we were really thinking, watching violent TV makes kids play aggressively. But more research has emerged, for example, that maybe parents' discipline style is the third variable that's causing both, the amount of violent TV that kids are able to view and the aggressive play that they're demonstrating. Okay, so then the other key reason for another key reason for correlation is just coincidence, right? Two things are kind of co-occurring, like this graph is showing us with the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine, but they're not actually related. The examples are often given that sunscreen, the use of sunscreen and shark attacks are correlated. It's not because sunscreen is causing shark attacks or vice versa. It's because both of those things are more likely to happen in the summer when people are out and swimming. And then we have got causality, which gets determined, as we're going to see, through longitudinal studies, which teases out which comes first, and experiments that involve random assignment. So examples of causal relationships are, we know that the lack of sleep causes a number of different things. It causes challenges to our cognition, it causes challenges to our mood, our physical health, and our ability to perform. Okay, so I see studies like this a lot in the media, that will say something like older people in Hong Kong who lived near open green spaces had longer telomeres, which is the tips of our chromosomes that tend to shorten with age. And so we want them to stay long so that our cells can keep dividing, we can live longer. And the implication when the media writes about studies like this, even though it's a correlational study, they didn't randomly assign people to live near green spaces, is implying that it's causal, right? That if we all moved to a green space, we'd all live longer. And that may actually be true. But let's talk through the kind of possible pathways, right? It could be one that's something about kind of living in plants, with more kind of oxygen being released, makes you live longer. But it also could be an income effect. It could not have anything to do with the plants. It could be that people who can afford to live near green spaces, because that's more expensive, can afford more healthcare, right? Better healthcare and better nutrition, right? So it's really just about income. It's not about green. Or it could be that people who live near green spaces are really like to exercise, and that's why they moved there, and they tend to exercise more, and it's an exercise effect. It's not so much a green space effect. That maybe no matter where you live, the more you exercise, the longer you live. So whenever you hear something in the media that's implying causation like that, you always want to be asking yourself, did they use random assignment? Did they follow people over time from before they lived near a green space till after they lived near a green space? Because if not, then it's correlational. So experiments, as you've learned, are one way that we can determine or work towards understanding causality. And the main key element of experiments is random assignment, where people are randomly assigned to either an experimental or treatment group and to a control group. And so an example of this would be, let's say we wanted to see if putting students in this special dorm environment that we've created at CSU, incoming students, if that helps improve their GPA at the end of the year. So we wouldn't just let people sign up for whatever dorm they wanted, because then we might not have kind of the academic level evenly distributed across the dorms. Instead, we would randomly assign some students to be in the special dorm and some students to just be in the regular dorm. And then we would, the independent variable would be, for example, which dorm that you're in, and the dependent variable would be their GPA. And we probably would pre-test their GPA before they came in to make sure that the average GPA was the same incoming for the special dorm and for the regular dorm. And then we would test the GPA again at the end of the year to see if we could show a change between students who were in the special dorm as compared to the control group of students who were in the regular dorm. So this is just another way to view experiments. So using that same example, the dorm example, we could randomly assign some students to be in the special dorm, which would be the participant group, and some students to be in the regular dorm, which would be the comparison group. And then we'd do a pre-test before they started at CSU, or right when they got here, for their GPA. Then we'd implement the program, which would be living in either the special dorm or the regular dorm for the whole year. And then our post-test would be checking GPA at the end of the year. Let's circle back on this idea of experiment versus natural experiment. So a researcher could have the same research question, like, do children who are more physically fit perform better on memory tasks or tests? And they could do that in an experiment form or a natural experiment form. So in both, the independent variable would be physical fitness, and the dependent variable might be some memory tasks or memory tests that the kids have to take. But the independent variable is going to change depending upon whether or not it's a true experiment or it's a natural experiment. So if we were to randomly assign them, maybe we'd have some third grade classrooms that were practicing brain breaks throughout the day, and some third grade classrooms who weren't. And we would randomly assign kids as they were coming into school to be in one of those types of classrooms or not. And we would have them take our memory tests at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of the day, depending upon whether we were doing this short-term or long-term. And then we'd have them do brain breaks or no brain breaks, right? And then we'd test to see if their performance on memory tasks had changed. So that would be like an example of random experiment. Natural experiment would be we just measure kids' physical fitness to figure out how fit they are, and then we see how well they're doing on memory tests. So we're not actually assigning them to any type of program. And so there was a research study that got at this where they brought kids into a lab, a natural experiment, where they brought kids into a lab. They had them run on a treadmill, not for exercise, but just to measure their VO2 max, their ability to kind of process oxygen to their muscles, as I understand it. And that was their measure of physical fitness. Kids who had higher VO2 max had higher physical fitness than kids with lower VO2 max. And then, so they measured their fitness, and then they had them do these memory tests. They also actually measured, in addition to memory tests, they measured the volume of their hippocampi, which is associated with memory in the brain. And they found that kids who had were naturally higher in physical fitness also had larger hippocampi, or their hippocampus, there's two of them, volume, and they did better on memory tests. Now, if they wanted, they couldn't determine causality with this, right? This is just correlation because there wasn't random assignment. If they wanted to determine causality, they would need to bring these same kids in, have some kids run on a treadmill, several times each week, some kids not. Of course, they'd have to make sure before they even started that they had kind of, the average performance on memory tests was the same across both groups, and then they could post-test it later. All right, lastly, let's just talk about ethics. So all institutions like CSU have institutional review boards, and anybody doing animal or human research has to go through that. So everybody in HDFS proposing a research study has to go through the IRB. And this is to make sure that we're preventing ethical violations and we're taking into account a variety of things. IRBs emerged due to some of those famous experiments that maybe you've learned about, the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram shock experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis study that caused long-term harm or even death for research subjects. So now we can't obviously do that anymore just because we want to, understand something. So the first thing is that people are guaranteed some protection from physical and psychological harm. And so they need to, basically the harm can't outweigh the benefits. So we can stress people out briefly, but we can't long-term kind of traumatize them. We could give chemotherapy, an experimental drug, experimental chemotherapy to someone with cancer, but not to a healthy research subject, right? Because in that case, the risks would not outweigh the potential benefits. And we need to make sure that people understand the risks prior to participating, that this could be stressful, that this could harm them, that, if they're going through a sleep deprivation study, there could be short-term effects associated with that. We particularly have to be careful about informed consent with vulnerable populations. In HDFS, this is kids, can't really consent, older adults who might, feel pressured and manipulated into it, people with intellectual disabilities, and captive populations like prisoners. We have to make sure that people aren't consenting just to get money without kind of understanding the potential risks. We have to ensure confidentiality, that we assign participants and their data with numbers. We don't store them with names so that they can't ever be, they are all de-identified. And if participants were deceived or manipulated in some way in the research or caused any stress, that we are debriefing them afterwards.